Imagine discovering that a document most people just, dismiss as this dusty, boring list of ancient religious rules is actually a subversive anti-imperial political treaty.
Oh, absolutely. It's wild.
Right, like a document that essentially laid the groundwork for the concept of human rights and systemic social safety nets and even the rule of law. You open it expecting a dry legal code, and instead you find this revolutionary manifesto that literally terrified ancient kings and completely rewired human ethics.
It really is the ultimate Trojan horse of ancient literature.
Yeah.
I mean, it presents itself in a very specific, recognizable historical format, but what it smuggles inside that format is basically a theological and political earthquake.
And that is exactly what we are plunging into today. We're taking a deep dive into an extensive, incredibly detailed document titled Survey of Deuteronomy by Chris R. Valasis.
It's a fantastic source to work from, yeah.
Yeah, and our mission here is to uncover why this specific ancient book is actually a thrilling blend of high-stakes political theater, a passionate farewell speech, and a blueprint for a radically just society. And for you listening, whether you're fascinated by the evolution of political science, ancient history, literature, or faith, well, the concepts we're going to explore today are the exact same concepts modern societies are still struggling to figure out.
Right, and to even begin to understand how radical this document is, we kind of have to clear away some linguistic debris first.
What do you mean by that?
Well, the very name most of the world uses for this book gives a really false impression of what it actually is.
You mean the word Deuteronomy itself?
Yes, exactly. When people hear Deuteronomy, they're hearing an anglicized version of the Greek translation, which is Deuteronomion. And that Greek word literally translates to second law, or like a copy of the law.
Which makes it sound incredibly tedious. Like
Right.
It's Leviticus Part 2, the uninspired sequel.
That's the exact trap the Greek title creates. But if we look at the original Hebrew title of the book, it's Devarim.
Okay, Devarim.
Yeah. And Devarim simply means words. It's taken from the very first phrase of the scroll. These are the words. It is not a secondary, entirely separate legal code being handed down to replace an old one.
So it's not a do-over.
No, not at all. It's an urgent, localized exposition of an existing covenant targeted at a very specific audience sitting on the edge of a monumental transition.
Reading through Velasquez's survey, the atmosphere of the book doesn't feel like a courtroom at all.
What did it feel like to you?
The analogy that just kept flashing in my mind is a locker room.
Oh, I like that.
Right. Picture a legendary, battle-scarred coach delivering a halftime speech right before the team takes the field for the championship game. The stakes are just existential. It's a do-or-die moment. The tension in the air is thick because everything they have worked for comes down to the next few hours.
That captures the narrative framework perfectly. I mean, we really have to look at the ground they are standing on to understand that tension. We are in what cultural anthropologists would call a liminal space, a threshold.
Put us in that space. Like, where are we geographically? And more importantly, where are we psychologically?
Geographically, the text places us on the plains of Moab. This is a region just east of the Jordan River. So Israel is poised right between two completely different realities.
Okay.
Behind them is a vast, harsh wilderness where they've been wandering as stateless nomads for decades. Directly ahead of them, across the river, is the promised land of Canaan, which is filled with established, fortified city-states.
Right, it's intimidating.
Very. But the transition isn't merely geographic, it is generational. And honestly, it is steeped in trauma.
Because the entire premise of this speech is that the previous generation utterly failed, right?
Yeah, the survey details this heavily. To understand the audience of Deuteronomy, you have to understand the disaster at a place called Kadesh Barnea.
Kadesh Barnea.
Right. The previous generation of Israelites, the people who actually witnessed the exodus from Egypt, who saw the plagues, who walked through the Red Sea, they stood at the edge of this exact same land years earlier.
Oh, wow.
But when they saw the fortified cities and the military strength of the Canaanites, they just succumbed to a profound, paralyzing fear. They refused to enter. They broke trust.
So they essentially looked at the championship game and decided to stay in the locker room.
Exactly. And the consequence of that unbelief was catastrophic. That entire adult generation was condemned to wander in the wilderness until they passed away. So the people listening to this massive address in Deuteronomy, the words, are the second generation. They are the children of the failure.
Imagine the psychological weight of that.
Right.
I mean, you've grown up in a desert camp your entire life defined by your parents' colossal mistake. You're a kinship society organized by tribal elders staring across a river at immense military and cultural superpowers.
Yep.
And Moses, the only leader you have ever known, is standing up to deliver his final sweeping address to bind you together so you don't repeat the sins of your fathers.
The message is incredibly stark. It's basically saying, you cannot afford to fail where they failed. You must choose loyalty. But of course, this dramatic setting brings us to the most fiercely contested question in the academic study of this book, the elephant in the room.
The authorship debate.
Exactly.
Who actually wrote this speech? Because if you flip to the very end of Deuteronomy, to chapter 34, the text literally describes the death, the burial, and the mourning period of Moses.
Right.
And unless we are dealing with a bizarre temporal paradox, you cannot write your own post-mortem obituary.
No, you definitely can't. And this is a puzzle that has consumed biblical scholars for centuries. The survey by Chris R. Velazquez breaks down this massive ongoing debate, and it presents three primary frameworks for understanding how this document came to exist.
Let's walk through those, and we should look at all three impartially to see how different traditions engage with the text.
Okay, let's start with the oldest paradigm. The survey calls this the traditional or canonical view. This is the perspective that takes the narrative framework at absolute face value.
Meaning Moses wrote it all.
Yes, Moses is the physical speaker and the actual writer of the vast majority of the book. He delivered these speeches on the plains of Moab, he wrote down the covenant stipulations, and the document is genuinely his final historical address.
And under that traditional framework, how do they account for the ending? The part where he dies?
They usually point to a successor. The argument is that someone like Joshua, who took the mantle of leadership, attached a brief, inspired epilogue to close out the life story of his mentor.
Kind of like an editorial postscript, essentially.
Exactly. Now, that view dominated for millennia. But then the survey introduces the classic critical view, which represents the mainstream consensus in modern secular and critical scholarship today.
And that completely upends the timeline, doesn't it?
Oh, completely. It argues that the final polished literary form of Deuteronomy we have today was composed centuries after Moses.
We're talking late 7th to early 6th centuries BC, right?
Yes. For context, this places the composition either during the sweeping religious reforms of King Josiah in the southern kingdom of Judah, or perhaps even later during the dark days of the Babylonian exile.
Wow, that is a huge time jump.
It is. The critical argument is that the nation of Judah was facing an existential crisis. They were being squeezed by the immense geopolitical pressure of the Assyrian Empire and later the Babylonian war machine. Their cultural and religious identity was fracturing under the weight of foreign influence.
So the theory is that later scribes, or maybe a coalition of priests and prophets in Jerusalem, composed this document, or at least heavily redacted older traditions, to essentially create a unifying theological manifesto.
Right.
A document designed to centralize all worship in Jerusalem and forge an ironclad national identity to survive the imperial pressure.
That is the core of the critical hypothesis, yeah. And then the survey outlines a third option which kind of attempts to bridge the gap.
The evangelical synthetic view.
Right. This perspective suggests that the foundational core of the speeches and the massive legal corpus genuinely originate with the historical Moses during that wilderness transition.
But it leaves room for editing.
Yes. It acknowledges that the text wasn't just locked in a vault. It was a living tradition that was legitimately and significantly updated, edited, and shaped canonically by later inspired writers over centuries.
Bringing it into its final polished form for subsequent generations.
Exactly. It explains the core Mosaic elements, but also the updated language and the ending.
I want to pull on a thread regarding that classic critical view for a moment, though.
Sure.
Let's really look at the implications of that timeline. If this document was largely composed centuries later by Jerusalem's scribes during a geopolitical meltdown with Assyria or Babylon, does that change what the book fundamentally is?
How do you mean?
Well, if a ruling class of priests wrote a document and put the words into the mouth of a legendary founding father like Moses just to force the rural populations to centralize their worship and pay tithes in Jerusalem, doesn't that make the book an ancient piece of political propaganda, a noble lie?
It's a highly uncomfortable question for modern readers, for sure, because our modern ethical framework insists on strict historical literalism and copyright.
Yeah, exactly.
When we hear pseudepigrapha writing under a false name, we immediately equate it with malicious forgery or political spin. But historians of the ancient Near East will point out that texts function very differently in antiquity.
How so? Walk us through the ancient mindset.
In the ancient world, attaching the name of a revered founder to a document wasn't necessarily viewed as deception. It was often viewed as a claim of continuity.
Continuity. Okay.
Yeah, a way of saying this is the authoritative application of the founders' core principles for our current crisis. But regardless of which specific timeline you adopt, whether you take the synthetic view of a long editorial process or the critical view of a late composition, the ultimate function of the document remains shockingly consistent.
It functions as a survival mechanism.
Exactly. Think about the threats. Whether Israel is a loose confederation of tribes facing the Canaanites across the Jordan River, or whether they are the kingdom of Judah centuries later facing the Assyrian siege ramps, the fundamental threat was always assimilation.
Because they just blend in.
Right. The danger was that they would simply absorb the surrounding cultures, worship the local fertility gods, and dissolve into the background noise of history.
And Deuteronomy is the firewall against that assimilation. It steps in and completely redefines what it means to be a nation.
Perfectly said.
It argues that your identity is not based on your physical borders, because borders are porous and can be conquered. Your identity is not based on your military strength, because there is always a bigger empire.
Always.
Your identity is based entirely, exclusively on a covenant with YHWH. And if they hold to that covenant, the text implies the community becomes indestructible even if the state collapses.
But to build that indestructible covenant, the author or authors of Deuteronomy did something breathtakingly brilliant. They didn't invent a new religious genre from scratch.
No, they didn't.
They looked around at the superpowers dominating their world, took the primary tool those empires used to subjugate people, and completely hijacked it.
This is where the political theater comes in. The survey dives into the literary structure of the book, pointing out that it perfectly mirrors ancient Near Eastern suzerain vassal treaties. Let's define those terms, because this is the key that unlocks the whole document.
Right. A suzerain is an ancient term for a supreme sovereign. Think of a massive expansionist emperor, the Hittite kings of the 2nd millennium BC, or the brutal Assyrian kings of the 1st millennium.
And the vassal.
The vassal is the lesser king, the ruler of a smaller, conquered nation who is now forced into subjugation.
So when an empire like Assyria rolled over a smaller state, they didn't just burn the cities and walk away. They imposed a highly formalized, legalistic treaty to ensure permanent control.
Correct. And modern archaeology has unearthed dozens of these actual treaties from the sands of the Middle East. Scholars, famously including George Mendenhall, began to notice in the mid-20th century that these imperial treaties all followed a rigid, predictable, and highly effective psychological pattern.
And when you lay that pattern over the Book of Deuteronomy, it is a one-to-one match. The survey by Velasquez maps out the chapters, and it is undeniable. Let's walk through the anatomy of an imperial treaty and how Deuteronomy copies it. What is step one?
Step one is the historical prologue. In a political treaty, the emperor would begin by listing his own benevolence. He would recount all the great things he had supposedly done for the vassal state.
Like, look how good I am to you.
Exactly. I protected your borders from other invaders. I established your current dynasty. It was a way of manufacturing a debt of gratitude. In Deuteronomy, this maps perfectly to chapters 1 through 4.
Oh, the historical review.
Right. Moses delivers a sweeping historical review of the wilderness journey, reminding the people of God's past acts of deliverance, specifically rescuing them from slavery in Egypt.
It's the suzerain presenting his resume. Here is the empirical evidence of my power and my protection.
Precisely. Once the debt is established, you move to step 2, the stipulations. This is the dense, terrifying core of the treaty. This is where the emperor lists his absolute demands. You will pay exactly this much tribute in grain and silver. You will provide this many thousands of soldiers for my army. You will not make alliances with Egypt.
And in Deuteronomy, this is the massive middle chunk of the book, chapters 5 through 26, the laws.
Yes.
But these aren't just military demands. It's an exhaustive societal blueprint covering worship, agriculture, criminal justice, and community ethics. We'll get into those specific laws later, but they form the massive terms of the agreement. What comes after the stipulations?
Step 3 is ratification, which specifically involves the reading of blessings and curses and the calling of witnesses.
That sounds intense.
It was. An Assyrian emperor would make the vassal king swear an oath, saying, "If you keep this treaty, my gods will bless your land with rain and peace. If you break it, if you withhold a single ounce of tribute, my gods will curse you with famine, disease, and I will personally come and destroy your cities."
Wow. And Deuteronomy copies that?
Exactly. Deuteronomy chapters 27 through 30 replicate this exactly. It features an incredibly intense, almost overwhelming list of covenant curses for disobedience exile, starvation, defeat, and profound blessings for loyalty.
And what about the witnesses?
Just like ancient treaties called upon the pagan gods to witness the oath, Deuteronomy calls upon the physical cosmos, heaven and earth, to act as the witnesses.
So we have the history, the demands, and the consequences. Is there a final step to close the contract?
Step 4 is succession and document clause. A smart emperor plans for the future. The treaty had to specify what would happen when the current vassal king died to ensure the next generation remained subjugated.
Keeping the control going.
Right. It also demanded that a physical copy of the treaty be placed in the vassal's holiest temple and read publicly on a regular schedule.
And Deuteronomy does this too.
Yes. Chapters 31 through 34 handle all of this. It details the formal commissioning of Joshua as Moses' successor. It commands that this very scroll be deposited beside the Ark of the Covenant. It mandates a public reading every 7 years, and it concludes with the death of Moses.
I was trying to think of a modern equivalent to this structure. At first, I thought of those massive terms of service agreements you get when you update your phone's software.
Oh, that's an interesting thought.
Right. It has the history of the software, the stipulations of what you can and can't reverse engineer, and the curses, meaning if you don't click agree, you can't use your device. But that analogy completely falls apart.
Why does it fall apart?
Because nobody actually reads a terms of service agreement.
That's very true.
The tech companies know you are going to blindly click accept and move on. The suzerain vassal treaty demands the exact opposite. It demands total obsessive internalization. It's more like a combination of a hyper-detailed national constitution and the most intense binding marriage vows ever written.
That is a much sharper analogy. It is a legally binding constitution that dictates the terms of an intensely personal relationship.
Yeah.
But we have to recognize the massive twist that makes Deuteronomy entirely unique in human history.
This is the part that genuinely blew my mind when reviewing the notes. In the ancient Near East, these treaties were strictly geopolitical.
Yes.
They were drafted between a human warlord with a massive army and a conquered human nation. They were enforced by the physical threat of chariots and spears. Deuteronomy takes this incredibly well-known, terrifying imperial format and applies it directly to a deity.
Yes. And it's difficult to overstate how revolutionary that shift is.
YHWH, the God of Israel, is not presenting himself the way other ancient gods presented themselves. He isn't a localized tribal spirit living on a specific mountain.
Right.
He isn't merely a nature deity you appease to make the rain fall or the crops grow. He is adopting the geopolitical language of a supreme emperor to declare himself the ultimate suzerain, the sovereign lord of the cosmos. And he is demanding exclusive, absolute allegiance.
We have to contrast this with the religious environment of the ancient world. The survey notes that the world Deuteronomy inhabited was completely saturated with polytheism and syncretism. And syncretism is the blending of different religious beliefs and practices.
It was essentially an ancient insurance policy. You worship YHWH because he is your national god and he brings victory in battle. But just in case, you also leave a little offering at the local shrine for Baal, the Canaanite storm god, to make sure your barley harvest doesn't fail. You hedge your bets.
Exactly. Ancient people worshipped a pantheon of gods to cover all their bases. It was highly pragmatic. But Deuteronomy uses the terrifying absolute language of an imperial treaty to shatter that pragmatism.
Because a king wouldn't share tribute.
Right. An Assyrian emperor would never tolerate a vassal paying half their tribute to Egypt. In the same way, the suzerain of Deuteronomy declares, "You serve me and me alone. There are no other alliances."
But the twist isn't just who the treaty is made with. It's what the treaty actually demands. Because a human emperor like the king of Assyria doesn't care how you feel about him.
Not at all.
He doesn't care if you secretly hate him in your heart, as long as the grain shipments arrive on time and the rebellion is suppressed. A political treaty is enforced by fear and violence, but this divine covenant introduces a shocking, completely unprecedented requirement for the vassal.
The requirement is love. The suzerain doesn't just want your agricultural tribute. He wants your absolute devotion.
Which brings us to the beating heart of the entire document. The theological center of gravity for Deuteronomy, found in chapter 6, verses 4 through 9. This passage is universally known as the Shema.
It is arguably the most important text in the history of Judaism, and foundational to Christianity as well. And the survey by Velazquez provides a deep lexical dive into the original Hebrew terminology used in this passage.
We really need to unpack these words, right?
We do, because translating them directly into English often strips them of their immense weight.
Let's do the deep dive. The passage gets its name from the very first Hebrew word, Shema. In English Bibles, this is almost always translated as hear. Hear, O Israel.
Right. But Shema means vastly more than mere auditory processing. It doesn't mean let these sound waves vibrate your eardrum. In the ancient Hebrew mindset, Shema means to listen, to pay deep attention, and to obey.
So they're connected.
Completely. The concepts of hearing and obeying are fused together into a single action. If you heard the command but did not act on it, you didn't actually Shema.
So hear, O Israel, is really a command to pay attention and execute these instructions. Then comes the core declaration. The Lord our God, the Lord is one. And immediately following that is the demand. You shall love the Lord your God. The Hebrew word used for love here is ahav.
Ahav. Now, we have a massive cultural barrier here. In modern Western culture, we have completely romanticized the concept of love. We equate it with sentimentality, emotion, a warm feeling, butterflies in the stomach.
Sure, Valentine's Day kind of stuff.
Exactly. But in the specific context of an ancient Near Eastern treaty, ahav is a political and legal term. It means covenant loyalty.
So it's not asking for a warm, fuzzy feeling. It's demanding fidelity.
It is an action. It means deliberately aligning your entire life, your resources, your physical energy, and your allegiances to the suzerain. It is the kind of fierce, unwavering loyalty a dedicated subject has for a righteous king, demonstrated through tangible obedience.
But wait, we can't strip all the emotion out of it because the very next word pulls it right back into the internal world of the human being. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart. The Hebrew word is lavav.
Yes, livav. And again, we have to discard our modern Valentine's Day symbolism. In ancient Hebrew anthropology, they didn't view the heart as the center of romantic emotion.
What was it then?
They viewed the lavav as the center of human volition.
Yeah.
It is the seat of willing, thinking, and desiring. It is the mind. It is the command center of the human organism.
So the command is to take your ultimate loyalty to ahav and route it entirely through your absolute command center, your lavav. And the survey also notes the concept of fearing God, using the word yer, which it carefully defines as reverent submission, not cowering, paralyzing terror.
Exactly. When you synthesize these concepts, Shema being active obedience, ahav being covenant loyalty, lavav being the command center of the will, and yer being reverent awe, the text is demanding a total whole-person integration.
You can't fake it.
No, you cannot just go through the religious motions. You cannot just bring a goat to the altar and walk away checking a box.
It demands that your inner desires and your outward actions are in perfect synchronization, which is a staggering, almost impossible standard. But there is a sequence of events highlighted in the survey that fundamentally alters how this massive demand is framed. I want to look closely at the order of operations here.
You're talking about the timeline of grace versus law.
Yes. In Deuteronomy, redemption happens before the law is ever given. It is explicitly stated. God went into Egypt, shattered the power of Pharaoh, and rescued the Israelites from brutal slavery first.
Right.
He did it entirely out of grace. And then, only after they are safe, after they are liberated and standing at Mount Sinai, does he give them the stipulations. He asks for obedience.
The survey emphasizes this heavily. It says, redemption from Egypt precedes law. Grace grounds obedience.
Let's compare that to how almost every other system in the world works, ancient or modern. In a modern meritocracy or a corporate performance review, the sequence is the exact opposite.
Oh, completely.
You perform the tasks, you hit the metrics, you obey the rules, and then you are rewarded with the promotion or the bonus. And if you look at ancient polytheistic religions, it was entirely transactional. You offer the sacrifice, you perform the incantation, and in exchange, you manipulate the deity into giving you rain or victory.
It's a cosmic vending machine.
Whoa.
You put the coins of obedience in, and you get the product of blessing out.
But Deuteronomy completely reverses the arrow of causality. God acts first. Chapter 7 explicitly says God didn't choose Israel because they were a massive, powerful empire or because they were inherently more righteous than anyone else.
With horns.
They were a small, insignificant slave population. He chose them simply because he loved them and decided to keep his promise to their ancestors.
So the obedience demanded by the treaty, the Shema, the ahav, is not the mechanism by which the vassal earns their freedom. The obedience is meant to be the natural, grateful response of a people who realize they have already been rescued from the abyss.
It's a beautiful theological concept, but the Book of Deuteronomy is not naive. It is incredibly, almost brutally realistic about human psychology.
How do you mean?
Well, because if the goal is this total, grateful, heart-level loyalty, the text recognizes a massive roadblock, and it introduces a visceral, almost shocking metaphor to diagnose the problem, the concept of the circumcised heart.
Ah, yes. We see this in Deuteronomy 10.16 and later in chapter 30. The text commands the people to circumcise the foreskin of your heart and be no longer stubborn.
It's an intense, invasive metaphor.
It is intentionally provocative.
Yeah.
Physical circumcision was the ancient outward sign of the covenant given generations earlier to Abraham. It was a physical marker on the body identifying an Israelite. But Deuteronomy is pushing violently past the external ritual.
It's looking inward.
Exactly. It is diagnosing the core disease of the human condition. The ultimate problem facing this nation wasn't a lack of information.
Because they had the laws. They literally had them carved in stone.
Right. The problem wasn't a lack of evidence either. This generation had eaten manna in the wilderness. They had seen the presence of God as a pillar of fire. The problem, as the text identifies it, was a hardness of heart. Their inner command center, the lavav, was encrusted. It was stubborn, selfish, and inherently resistant to yielding control to the suzerain.
Think about how deeply relevant that diagnosis is to modern society. Think about how often we attempt to fix systemic societal issues, poverty, crime, corruption, by simply passing new legislation or building new regulatory agencies or flooding the population with more data and education.
We do that a lot.
We operate on the assumption that humans are fundamentally rational, and if people just knew better, they would do better.
We assume the problem is a lack of data.
But Deuteronomy is sitting in the ancient dust saying, no, the root issue isn't data. The root issue is human desire and allegiance. You can have all the sociological data in the world, you can have the most perfectly crafted laws, but if the human heart is hard, people will still find a way to act selfishly and exploit each other.
The text insists that humanity is morally responsible for its actions, but deeply, tragically prone to forgetfulness and rebellion. The call to circumcise the heart is a profound recognition that external laws cannot produce internal righteousness. It foreshadows the need for a radical inner spiritual surgery that the people cannot perform on themselves.
Okay, but this creates a massive practical problem. If this deep inner transformation of the heart is the ultimate goal, but the people's hearts are currently uncircumcised and stubborn, how do you keep society from completely tearing itself apart in the meantime?
Right. You need something to hold it together.
You need a structure.
Yeah.
You need a system that enforces outward justice and protects the vulnerable, even when the inward desire of the population isn't there yet. Is that where the massive legal code comes into play?
Exactly. That transition takes us into the sprawling middle section of the book, chapters 12 through 26. This is the core law code, the detailed stipulations of the treaty. And what becomes immediately clear, as the survey points out, is that Deuteronomy never separates vertical theology from horizontal sociology.
Meaning, how you treat God dictates how you treat your neighbor.
Yes, holiness isn't restricted to what a priest does inside a temple. Holiness is public, it is economically embodied, and it is intensely communal.
To understand these laws, we have to paint a picture of the economic reality this text assumes. The survey lists the conditions. It is a subsistence agrarian economy. We are talking about land, grain harvests, vineyards, olive groves, and flocks of sheep and goats.
And no safety nets like we have today.
Exactly. There is no stock market, no digital wealth. Your entire survival depends on the whims of the weather and the yield of the soil.
And in the ancient Near East, an agrarian economy is an incredibly fragile economy. A single drought, a locust swarm, or an invading army could wipe out your family's inheritance. And when that happened, there was no bankruptcy court.
It was over.
The reality of ancient debt was crushing. If you couldn't pay your creditors, you lost your land. If you still couldn't pay, you had to sell your own children or yourself into debt slavery.
It was a brutal system where the wealthy consolidated land and power, and the poor fell into permanent generational servitude. And this is exactly where Deuteronomy steps in and mandates a radical, systemic social safety net.
Which was unheard of.
It establishes legal structures designed specifically to interrupt the accumulation of wealth and protect the most vulnerable members of society.
The text repeatedly, almost obsessively, groups together 4 specific categories of people who lack traditional power or land rights: the widow, the orphan, the resident alien meaning the immigrant or refugee living among them, and the Levite, the priestly tribe, who were not given a land inheritance.
Let's examine some of these specific economic laws because they are staggering when you place them in their ancient context. Let's start with how they handled that crushing reality of debt slavery.
We look to Deuteronomy 15, which outlines the law of the Sabbath year. The text mandates that every 7 years, there must be a total release of debts across the nation.
Every 7 years.
Every 7 years. If an Israelite family had fallen into devastating poverty and had been forced to sell themselves into servitude to a wealthier neighbor to survive, the seventh year acted as an automatic reset button. They were legally required to be set free.
Which is incredible enough on its own, but the law goes even further. It explicitly commands the master that when he releases the servant, he cannot let them go empty-handed.
Right. Deuteronomy 15 commands the master to supply the freed servant liberally from the flock, from the threshing floor, and from the winepress.
Think about the economic disruption of that. You aren't just losing free labor. You are legally mandated to give away a portion of your own capital to essentially fund a stimulus package for the person you just freed, so they don't immediately fall back into poverty.
It's radical.
And what is the rationale the text gives to the wealthy landowner for doing this?
The rationale is deeply anchored in memory. The text explicitly says, "You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. Therefore I command you this today."
There it is again. The theology dictates the economics. Because you, the wealthy landowner, were once a helpless slave who was given unmerited grace and freedom by God, you must structurally extend that exact same grace to the impoverished person in front of you.
It is a profound equalization of human dignity. And we see this anti-greed mechanism built into the very process of harvesting food. The survey highlights the laws of gleaning found in chapter 24.
How did gleaning work in practice?
The law states that when a farmer is reaping the wheat harvest in his field, if he forgets a sheaf of grain behind him, he is legally forbidden from turning back to get it. He must leave it. It belongs to the alien, the orphan, and the widow.
Wow.
When a farmer is beating his olive trees to harvest the oil, he is not allowed to go over the branches a second time to strip them bare. When he gathers grapes from his vineyard, he must leave the fallen grapes and the underdeveloped clusters.
So the law is intentionally enforcing inefficiency. It is structurally limiting the farmer's ability to maximize his profit. He is commanded to leave a percentage of his own gross domestic product on the ground to ensure the physical survival of the marginalized.
It is a decentralized welfare system, integrated directly into the agricultural cycle without the need for a massive, corruptible government bureaucracy.
And God's concern for economic justice extends right into the marketplace. The survey references the laws of fair weights and measures in chapter 25.
In ancient commerce, you weighed out silver and grain using stone weights on a scale. A common, deceitful practice was to carry 2 sets of weights in your bag. A slightly heavier stone used when you were buying goods, and a slightly lighter stone used when you were selling them. It was a way to slowly skim profit off every transaction.
Deuteronomy strictly forbids it. It calls the practice an abomination. God actually cares about the accuracy of the scales in the local market.
Because, as the survey fundamentally argues, justice is worship in social form. You cannot stand in the sanctuary and claim to love YHWH with all your heart while simultaneously using rigged scales to exploit your neighbor. The vertical and the horizontal are inextricably linked.
I follow the logic of all these social justice elements. They're incredibly progressive, even by modern standards. But as I read through the survey, I hit a massive structural mandate right at the beginning of the legal code that made me stop and raise an eyebrow. It feels like it contradicts this entire ethos of localized care.
You are referring to the centralization of worship in Deuteronomy 12.
Exactly. Right out of the gate, the text demands that once Israel enters the land, all the local shrines, all the neighborhood altars, all the high places scattered across the towns must be completely destroyed. And moving forward, everyone in the entire nation is legally forced to bring their sacrifices, their tithes, and their festivals to one single location, the place the Lord will choose, which, as history unfolds, eventually becomes the temple in Jerusalem.
It is a massive administrative and theological shift.
But doesn't that mandate sound dangerously authoritarian? I mean, forcing a dispersed rural population to travel for days to one central city, controlled by one specific elite group of priests. It sounds like a corporate monopoly on religion.
I can see how it looks that way.
It inevitably consolidates all the wealth, the meat from the sacrifices, and the political power in one zip code. How does centralizing power like that fit with a book that supposedly cares about protecting the marginalized from exploitation?
That is a very sharp, perceptive critique. And it is exactly the tension that critical scholars point to when they argue this book was written by Jerusalem priests trying to secure their own power base. But to understand the logic of the text itself, we have to look closely at the religious and historical context. We have to ask, why were these local, rural, high places viewed as such an existential threat to the nation?
Okay, what was actually happening at the local level?
We mentioned the word earlier, syncretism. The local hilltop shrines were the front lines of assimilation. When an Israelite farmer went to a local altar to offer a sacrifice, he was invariably interacting with the entrenched Canaanite culture around him. And Canaanite religion wasn't just a different flavor of theology.
What was it then?
It was heavily focused on fertility cults, ritual prostitution, divination, and in extreme cases, the sacrifice of children to gods like Molech to secure good harvests.
So the local shrines were porous. The theology was constantly being infected.
Exactly. Centralizing worship wasn't merely an administrative power grab. It was an act of desperate quality control. It was the only way to protect the purity of the covenant. And here's why that matters for the marginalized. If the theology gets corrupted at the local level, the ethics will inevitably collapse.
Walk me through that connection.
If a local village slowly starts absorbing Canaanite theology, worshiping gods who represent the ruthless forces of nature, gods who demand human sacrifice or turn a blind eye to the strong dominating the weak, how long do you think that village is going to keep observing the Sabbath year debt release? How long will they keep leaving their grain for the widow and the immigrant?
Not very long.
No.
The ethical mandates are entirely dependent on the character of YHWH. If you lose the true picture of YHWH, you lose the rationale for the social safety net.
Precisely. Centralizing worship was a drastic, necessary measure to preserve the exclusive loyalty to the suzerain, because that exclusive loyalty was the only foundation keeping the radical justice laws intact.
That reframes it completely. You have to protect the source code of the culture. But if the concern is still about the dangerous consolidation of human power in one central city, the text anticipates that exact anxiety.
It does.
And it addresses it in one of the most astonishing passages in ancient literature. We have to look at Deuteronomy chapter 17, verses 14 through 20, the law concerning the king.
It is a text that completely shatters ancient political norms.
Moses is essentially prophesying. He says, one day, Israel will settle in the land. They will look around at all the massive empires surrounding them, and they will say, we want a king over us, like all the nations that are around us. And God says, okay, you can appoint a king, but here are the constitutional parameters for his reign. And the rules it lays down place unprecedented, almost absurd limits on the executive power of the monarch.
Unprecedented is the correct word. Let's break down the three massive prohibitions placed on the king.
Prohibition number 1. He must not acquire many horses for himself or send the people back to Egypt to acquire more horses. In the context of the ancient Near East, what does a ban on horses actually mean?
Horses were not used for agriculture. They were used exclusively for war chariots. They were the main battle tanks of the ancient world. So forbidding the king from multiplying horses is explicitly forbidding him from building a massive, aggressive, expansionist standing army. He is not allowed to build a military-industrial complex to conquer his neighbors.
Prohibition number 2. He must not acquire many wives for himself, lest his heart turn away. Now, modern readers often view this purely through the lens of marital ethics. But in the ancient geopolitical landscape, what did a royal harem represent?
It represented foreign policy. In antiquity, royal marriages were the primary mechanism for sealing political treaties. To have many wives meant to forge complex diplomatic alliances with surrounding nations, which inevitably involved importing their foreign gods, their temples, and their political influence into the capital city. The text is demanding that Israel's security rely on the covenant with YHWH, not on a web of international treaties.
And prohibition number 3. He must not acquire for himself excessively large amounts of silver and gold. He cannot weaponize the taxation system to hoard the nation's wealth for his own luxury and self-aggrandizement.
So let's look at the composite picture. No massive military machine, no complex international alliances, and no hoarding of national wealth. By the standards of an Egyptian pharaoh or a Babylonian emperor, you have just stripped the king of every single attribute that makes an ancient king a king. You have rendered him geopolitically impotent.
But the text doesn't just tell the king what he can't do, it prescribes exactly what he's supposed to do with his time on the throne. The law states that when the king takes the throne, he's required to physically write out for himself a copy of this Torah, this very law we are discussing on a scroll. And he must keep it with him, and he must read from it every single day of his life.
The philosophical extrapolation of this command is profound. We have to contrast this with the surrounding empires. In Egypt, the pharaoh wasn't just a ruler. He was considered the incarnate son of the gods. In Babylon, the emperor was the source of the law. His spoken word was absolute divine decree.
But here in Deuteronomy,
Here, the text takes the highest human executive power in the nation and actively, deliberately subordinates it to a written objective standard. The king is not above the Torah. He is not the source of the law. He is a subject of the law, held to the exact same standard as any other citizen.
wow.
In fact, the text explicitly states the purpose of him reading it daily, so that his heart may not be lifted up above his brothers. He is not a demigod. He is just a brother with a specific role.
This is a staggering critique of absolute sacralized power. It is introducing the concept of the rule of law overriding the rule of man. It is essentially the Magna Carta, but it was written thousands of years earlier, sitting right there in the dust of the ancient Near East.
And these radical ideas, a religion demanding inward heart transformation, a mandated structural social safety net, and a constitutionally constrained political power. These ideas didn't just fade into the archaeological strata, they became the foundational bedrock for the most influential figures and movements in the centuries that followed, echoing all the way into the New Testament.
Which brings us to the next crucial phase of our deep dive. Because this text wasn't just a philosophical thought experiment floating in the ether. It existed in real time, in real history. And I want to anchor us in the physical evidence. The survey by Balassis includes a fascinating section on the archaeological background. We know archaeology rarely proves every narrative detail of an ancient text, but what kind of physical evidence do we actually have that illuminates the world Deuteronomy inhabited?
You're right, modern archaeology functions best when it provides context, illuminating the cultural and linguistic world the text assumes. And there are several major discoveries mentioned in the survey that we should explore.
Let's start with the most famous one, the Dead Sea Scrolls. Most people have at least heard the name, but how do they specifically relate to the Book of Deuteronomy?
The Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in the mid-20th century, hidden in caves near the settlement of Qumran, near the Dead Sea. They date roughly from the 3rd century BC to the 2nd century AD. Among the thousands of fragments and scrolls found, Deuteronomy is one of the most highly represented books in the entire collection. They found over 30 copies of it.
What does that sheer volume tell us?
It proves not only the immense antiquity of the text, but it demonstrates how widely circulated and incredibly central the book was to the Jewish communities of the Second Temple period. It wasn't an obscure reference document, it was the active, beating heart of their theological identity.
The survey also mentions an artifact called the Katef Hinnom amulets. I had never heard of these before reading the source material, but the description sounds incredible. Tiny silver scrolls.
Yes, these were discovered in a burial tomb in the Hinnom Valley, just outside the old city of Jerusalem. They date back to the late 7th or early 6th century BC.
Okay, so that timeline is crucial. That places them right at the end of the First Temple period, potentially during the reign of King Josiah, or the lead up to the devastating Babylonian exile we discussed earlier in the authorship debate.
Exactly. These artifacts are tiny, fragile pieces of silver rolled up tightly, designed to be worn around the neck as amulets. And when archaeologists painstakingly unrolled them, they found faint inscriptions. The text inscribed on the silver is a priestly blessing that closely, almost identically, parallels the famous blessing found in the Book of Numbers, which is part of the same 5-book Torah tradition as Deuteronomy.
Why is finding a few sentences on a piece of silver such a massive deal?
Because it represents some of the earliest known biblical text parallels ever discovered in physical form. It demonstrates definitively that the complex scribal culture and the specific, highly developed theological language that the Torah assumes was actively present, written down, and circulating in Jerusalem prior to the Babylonian destruction.
It grounds the textual tradition in the physical dirt of Jerusalem. And then the survey mentions one more major artifact, the Moabite stone, also known as the Mesha Still.
This is a black basalt stone monument dating to the mid-9th century BC, discovered in modern-day Jordan. This is the very region where the plains of Moab are located, the exact geographical setting where Moses supposedly delivers the Deuteronomy speeches. The stele features a royal inscription by a Moabite king named Mesha, and he is boasting about his military conflicts with the kingdom of Israel.
So it's essentially ancient war propaganda from Israel's neighbor. How does that help us understand Deuteronomy?
It confirms the geopolitical reality of the region. It shows that the nations mentioned in Deuteronomy, Moab, Edom, Ammon, were real, highly organized, politically active entities that were fiercely interacting and warring with Israel. It illuminates the immense pressure of the historical stage on which the book is set. Israel was surrounded by hostile, well-armed neighbors.
Okay, so we have physical artifacts, silver amulets, ancient scrolls, basalt monuments anchoring the text and history. But the cultural and theological echoes of Deuteronomy travel much further than ancient stones. The survey outlines a section called the Ultimate Typology, which connects Deuteronomy directly to the New Testament. And when you look at the data, it turns out that Deuteronomy is essentially the foundational script for the early Christian movement.
It absolutely is. Let's define that term first. Typology is a theological concept where an early historical event, person, or institution serves as a prophetic pattern, a type that perfectly foreshadows a later, greater fulfillment. Think of it like brilliant foreshadowing in a masterful movie, where an early, seemingly isolated scene perfectly mirrors and explains the climactic resolution at the end of the film.
And Deuteronomy provides the types.
It does. Deuteronomy is among the most frequently cited Old Testament books in the entire New Testament. Yeah. And it is not just used for random proof texting to win arguments. It provides the fundamental structural architecture for understanding who Jesus of Nazareth is and what he came to accomplish.
Let's look at the most vivid example of this. The narrative of Jesus in the wilderness, found in Matthew chapter 4. We have to set the scene to see the typology at work. Jesus has just been baptized, and he is led into the barren Judean desert where he fasts for exactly 40 days.
The parallel is immediate. The 40 days of Jesus directly mirrors the 40 years the nation of Israel spent wandering in the wilderness.
While he is starving and exhausted, the devil approaches and subjects him to 3 intense temptations. He tempts him to turn stones into bread, to test God's protection by jumping from the temple, and to bypass the suffering of the cross by bowing down and receiving the kingdoms of the world immediately. And every single time Jesus responds to counter these temptations, he uses a specific weapon. What does he quote?
In all 3 responses, Jesus quotes exclusively from the Book of Deuteronomy, specifically from chapters 6 and 8. When tempted with bread, he says, "Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God," quoting Deuteronomy 8.3. When dared to jump, he says, "You shall not put the Lord your God to the test," quoting Deuteronomy 6.16. When offered worldly power, he commands, "You shall worship the Lord your God, and him only shall you serve," quoting Deuteronomy 6.13.
It's like he is using the scroll of Deuteronomy as a psychological and spiritual shield.
It's much deeper than just using it as a shield. The typology here is profound. Jesus is stepping onto the stage acting as the true Israel. Where the corporate nation of Israel tragically failed their halftime test in the wilderness at Kadesh Barnea, where they complained about food, tested God's patience, and worshipped idols, Jesus, acting as the true obedient son, is passing the exact same test, in the exact same environment, using the exact words given to the first generation. He's rewriting the history of failure.
And later in his ministry, when the religious scholars try to trap him by asking him to distill hundreds of laws down to one single greatest commandment, he doesn't invent a new philosophy. He goes straight back to the foundational text we discussed earlier. He quotes the Shema, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart." He identifies the total whole-person devotion demanded by the ancient suzerain as the absolute center of the entire biblical ethic.
And this reliance on Deuteronomy continues heavily with the Apostle Paul. In his letter to the Romans, when Paul is trying to articulate the accessibility of the gospel, the radical idea that you don't have to perform impossible feats, climb up to heaven, or descend into the abyss to find salvation, he grounds his argument in Deuteronomy chapter 30. He quotes Moses saying, "The word is near you, in your mouth and in your heart." Paul takes the Deuteronomic language of the covenant and uses it as the very bedrock for his theology of faith.
This brings up a really compelling question for me, especially when looking at how the New Testament handles some of the more specific prophetic elements of Deuteronomy. For instance, in Deuteronomy 18, Moses explicitly promises that God will eventually raise up a prophet like Moses from among the people. And then in Deuteronomy 21.23, buried in the legal code, there's this highly specific, almost bizarre law that states anyone executed and hung on a tree is under God's curse. And Paul directly takes that ancient law and applies it to Jesus dying on the wooden cross in his letter to the Galatians.
Yes, the concept of the curse-bearing criminal.
So here's my question. Knowing everything we have unpacked over the last hour, the suzerain's demand for a perfectly circumcised heart, the totalizing love command, the absolute purity required to maintain the covenant, and the tragic reality of human stubbornness. Is the Book of Deuteronomy essentially setting up an impossible standard? Is it a standard that the nation of Israel is bound to fail from the very beginning, deliberately designed by the author so that a future figure like Jesus in the Christian tradition can step in as the ultimate necessary fulfillment?
You are identifying the crux of what scholars call the redemptive historical interpretation of the Bible. It is a big academic term, but it simply means reading the entire sweep of Scripture as one unified story of God's redemption playing out over time, where the early failures highlight the need for a final Savior. And to answer your question, we have to look at how the Book of Deuteronomy itself views the future. The text is not wildly optimistic. It is surprisingly, almost brutally realistic about what is going to happen.
Where do we see that realism?
In chapter 28, Moses lays out the exhaustive list of blessings for obedience and curses for rebellion. And as the speech progresses, the tone shifts from conditional warnings to absolute prophecy. Moses explicitly predicts the failure of the covenant. He essentially tells the people, you are going to fail. Your hearts will eventually turn away to other gods. The covenant curses will fall upon you. The empires will come, and you will be driven out of this land into exile. The book fully anticipates the catastrophic failure of the corporate nation.
That is an incredibly depressing way to end a halftime locker room speech. Go out there and conquer the land, play your hearts out. But by the way, I've seen the future and you are going to blow the game, lose the championship, and get kicked out of the league.
It would be a tragedy if the book ended at chapter 28. But then you turn to the climax in chapter 30. And Moses says something revolutionary. He says, when all these things come upon you, the blessing and the curse, and you are sitting in exile among the foreign nations, if you return to the Lord, He will restore you. And then comes the crucial ultimate promise of the entire book. The Lord your God will circumcise your heart and the heart of your offspring, so that you will love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, that you may live.
Oh, I see it now. The law diagnoses the terminal disease of the hard heart, and when the patient inevitably collapses, God promises to step in and perform the surgery himself. God promises to eventually do for the people what they were fundamentally incapable of doing for themselves.
Exactly. The rigorous demands of the law expose the depths of human stubbornness, which in turn points to the absolute necessity of divine intervention. So, in the Christian synthesis of this text, Jesus of Nazareth isn't just a random historical figure who happens to quote ancient scripture well. He is the culmination of the entire Deuteronomic logic. He is the prophet greater than Moses who was promised in chapter 18. He is the perfect covenant mediator. He is the obedient vassal who perfectly loves the suzerain. And most importantly, on the cross, he willingly absorbs the ultimate covenant curse, the exile, the execution on the tree on behalf of a failing people, so that the promise of the circumcised, renewed heart can finally be poured out.
What an astonishing, sweeping narrative arc. We have covered a massive amount of conceptual ground today. I want to bring us back to the present moment and just summarize the incredible journey we have been on through the survey of Deuteronomy. We started in the dusty, tense, liminal space of the plains of Moab, with an entire generation standing on the threshold of a new world, deeply traumatized by the failures of their parents.
We examined how this brilliant ancient document completely hijacked the terrifying political format of imperial suzerain vassal treaties. It subverted the propaganda of emperors to declare that the God of the cosmos doesn't just want outward robotic compliance or pragmatic sacrifices. He demands exclusive, wholehearted loyalty.
We looked at the revolutionary, deeply practical ideas embedded in its core law code. We saw how it instituted radical social safety nets for the vulnerable, mandated the forgiveness of crushing debt, structurally limited the hoarding of wealth, and enacted a stunning limitation on human executive power, explicitly placing the king under the authority of an objective, written law.
And we traced how those profound themes of covenant loyalty, the necessity of memory, and the promise of a renewed heart echoed through the centuries. We saw them grounded in the silver amulets of Jerusalem and the caves of Qumran, ultimately finding their vast theological fulfillment in the life, testing, and work of Jesus in the New Testament.
If there is one overarching takeaway for you, the listener, from this massive exploration, it is a concept the expert touched on earlier regarding the Sabbath year. Deuteronomy ultimately teaches us that memory is a vital spiritual discipline. As individuals and as a collective society, our identity is ultimately formed by what we remember and by what or whom we love the most. If you forget your own history of redemption, if you forget that you were once a slave who received grace, your heart will inevitably harden, you will become the oppressor, and your society will fracture.
The ultimate battleground of faithfulness is not the geographic border of a nation. It is always the inner territory of the human heart.
Which leaves me with one final lingering thought, a paradox that I haven't been able to shake since reading the outline. We talked about how the book ends in chapter 34 with the succession clause. Moses, the legendary leader, the great mediator, the man who the text says spoke to God face to face, climbs to the peak of Mount Nebo. He looks out over the Jordan River. He sees the entirety of the Promised Land spread out beautifully before him, the exact land he has spent 40 agonizing years leading these stubborn people toward.
But he doesn't get to go in. He dies right there, on the mountain, outside the land of promise.
It feels incredibly tragic. It feels unresolved. But what if that lack of resolution is the most profound lesson of the entire ancient masterpiece? What if the tragic, premature end of Moses is deliberately designed by the author to force us to put our ultimate hope in the message itself rather than the messenger? What if it is a permanent reminder that no human leader, no matter how visionary, how faithful, or how uniquely gifted, can ultimately deliver us to our final destination? That human law and human leaders can only bring you to the border, but something else or someone else has to carry you across.
That is a profound question and one worth carrying with you long after the deep dive is over.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the words of Deuteronomy. Keep asking hard questions, keep challenging your assumptions about ancient texts, and we will catch you next time.